Okay, let's get right into it. When you think about the collapse of Japan's bubble economy, there's probably one idea that immediately jumps to mind.
You hear this all the time, right? The story goes that land and stock prices just got so overheated, so completely disconnected from reality, that the market, well, it just naturally corrected itself. A spectacular, but kind of inevitable self-destruction.
But that's not what happened. Not really. The bubble didn't just pop on its own. It was pushed. See, the collapse was actually the result of a very clear sequence of events, a series of deliberate actions that turned a wild party into an absolute catastrophe.
To really understand how it was popped, we first have to look at how it got so inflated in the first place. And this whole story, it doesn't start in the markets. Nope, it starts with politics.
It all kicked off with the Plaza Accord back in 1985. This agreement made the Japanese yen absolutely skyrocket, which, you can imagine, just hammered Japan's export-heavy economy. Fearing a massive recession, the government and the Bank of Japan basically panicked. And their solution? A super extreme policy of monetary easing. They slashed interest rates to historic lows. And that, right there, was the first domino to fall.
And this lays out the chain reaction perfectly. With interest rates practically at zero, money was almost free. So what did companies do? They borrowed huge amounts of cash, not to build factories or innovate, but to speculate. They poured all that cheap money into stocks and, most importantly, into real estate. The fuse was officially lit. So by the late 80s, things were just going vertical. I mean, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were famously said to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. It was pure mania.
And this is really the key question, isn't it? Everybody could see how insane things were getting, so why on earth did the authorities just let the party get so ridiculously out of control?
Well, the answer is it's complicated. You had all these powerful forces working together to keep the bubble inflating. First, there was this cultural belief, they called it the land myth, that property values only ever go up. Then you had politicians who loved the tax money pouring in. The banks, they were making a fortune lending against land that was worth more every single day. And on top of all that, there was intense international pressure not to raise interest rates because they were afraid of sparking another yen crisis. So nobody, absolutely nobody wanted to be the one to stop the music.
But here's the thing. Eventually, they didn't just stop the music. They basically dynamited the entire building. The collapse wasn't some kind of accident. It was triggered by two very specific, very shocking policy decisions.
You know, a soft landing was totally possible. A gentle, gradual increase in interest rates over time could have let the air out of the bubble slowly. But instead, policymakers waited for years, and then they slammed on the brakes with every ounce of force they had. It was pretty much the worst possible way to handle it.
So the first trigger was the shock rate hike. Just look at the speed here. In a little over a year, the Bank of Japan more than doubled the interest rate, shooting it up from 2.5% to 6%. This wasn't a gentle tap on the brakes. This was like throwing the engine into reverse at full speed.
The effect was immediate. Credit, which was the absolute lifeblood of the bubble, was choked off. All those companies that had borrowed billions couldn't afford their loans anymore. Suddenly, all the buyers for stocks and land just vanished. The entire machine started spinning violently backwards.
And then, just as the market was reeling from the rate hikes, came the knockout blow. The Ministry of Finance issued this unprecedented order known as Total Volume Control. It was a direct command to every single financial institution: stop lending to real estate, period. End of story.
This was the final nail in the coffin. The government didn't just take away the punch bowl at the party, it shut off the water mains to the entire city. The real estate market, which ran entirely on credit, just seized up. Transactions ground to a halt, and with everyone trying to sell and absolutely no one able to get a loan to buy, prices didn't just fall, they utterly collapsed.
So the crash itself was catastrophic, but what happened next? The policy response to the collapse, well, that's what sealed Japan's fate for the next several decades.
The aftermath was basically a masterclass in what not to do. The banks, terrified of their losses, stopped lending to everyone, even healthy businesses. This created a brutal credit crunch. They also hid how bad their loans really were for years, creating these zombie companies and stopping any real recovery. And the government's response? It was slow, it was fragmented, and it was completely inadequate for the scale of the problem.
This chain of events didn't just cause a recession. It fundamentally rewired the entire DNA of the Japanese economy.
It created the conditions that we are still seeing today.
So why should we care about policy mistakes from 3 decades ago? Well, because the fallout from those exact decisions is still shaping wages, careers, and the whole economic landscape for an entire generation.
Think about it. The trauma of the collapse created a generation of super cautious banks that are just unwilling to take risks on new ideas. It led to companies that hoard cash instead of investing it in growth or raising wages, and it kicked off this huge shift to non-regular employment as companies tried to cut costs, locking in the wage stagnation that has basically defined the lost decades. When you lay it all out like this, the picture is crystal clear. This wasn't the market just correcting itself. This was a devastating chain of policy failures. First, the failure to act early. Then, a violent and badly timed crackdown. And finally, a completely bungled cleanup operation. Each mistake just made the next one even worse.
So in the end, the story of Japan's bubble isn't a story of market greed running wild. It's a story of policy error. It wasn't an earthquake or a tsunami. It was a series of decisions made by people in rooms that ultimately triggered a man-made economic disaster.